Everyone, welcome to another video. Today's video topic will be covering this image. I've actually had to go back and correct it because the Bible never says Jerusalem, it always says Jericho. That is an example of the followers of Muhammad cherry picking the Bible again and being hypocrites because they state that Christians cherry pick the Quran, so they are showing themselves to be again hypocrites. Not saying that Christians aren't hypocrites, but that both are hypocrites. Uh, okay, so I've changed to Jericho. There's actually an extra verse though, which helps a lot. But you see that Mark 10:46, as Jesus was leaving Jericho, not Jerusalem, guys, Jericho. And then Luke says as he was entering Jericho. So there seems to be a contradiction, correct? And let's see if the Bible can actually explain it. And we need to have context behind it. So Mark 10:46 says they came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples. So we know that he was leaving Jericho and he healed the blind men. Understandably, that the Gospels one records two blind men, which you read that in Matthew. It says that there were actually two blind men, but Mark and Luke only refer to one, which the reason why they refer to one, and again, that's not a contradiction right there. If you say that there is, if one group says that there are two blind men, and then one says that, if one gospel says, there are two blind men and they are healed, and then the other one says there is a blind man healed, it doesn't actually contradict. It states that there was at least one blind man healed, but the other one stating that it was that guy and another guy. So that's not a contradiction, only if you actually cherry pick, which is taking things out of context. Luke 18:35 says he was coming to Jericho, or coming near Jericho. And we have two that are saying that he. We have two that are saying that. We have Mark and Matthew stating that the healing took place as Jesus was leaving Jericho, and Luke says he was entering Jericho. So, is that a contradiction? No. You have to understand that there were actually two Jerichos. There was the old Jericho and there was the new Jericho. And Mark and Matthew, being familiar with, being Jewish roots, being very familiar with old Jericho, they would more than likely strictly talk about, old Jericho. But Luke, on the other hand, was Greek, and he had Greek culture. Everything about him was pretty much Greek. So he was more familiar with the new Jericho. And his audience, because you have to understand that each writer had their own particular audience. Well, Mark and Matthew are more for Jewish readers, as Luke was more for Gentile readers, or Greek readers. So depending on which audience you were, you'd be able to understand because of who it's coming from. So most of the audience from both Matthew and Mark, they understood, they're familiar with old Jericho, so that's what they're going to understand. But Luke is writing specifically for new Jericho, and that doesn't make that a contradiction. In fact, if one was to go to certain countries that have rebuilt, there's a city in Iraq, actually, I forgot the name of it, but pretty much there is the original location, and then there is the location on top of it. But the new city on top of the old city is not exactly in the same boundary. So the way it works is that the new city was actually, I believe, a few miles away from the old city, but it eventually moved. The boundaries moved into covering past the old city. So you have a much larger city now that's standing on top of the older city. So someone who was familiar with the old city would, say they were leaving the old city and going to the new city, and other people would just say other people might say that it's only one city, and the other people who actually knew of the old city might, classify it as being two areas, two different cities. And that's not a contradiction. It's just the one is more familiar with uh, the way it used to be, the one is more familiar with what it is now. So again, that's not a contradiction. That's just cherry picking and taking things out of context, and uh, and definitely, again, there is no contradiction in there. We have three different gospels that are actually uh, two are aligning themselves together, so we would understand, okay, that must be what it's at least referring to. And then of course we have another one that's giving a slightly different context, but they both come together because they both say, okay, there are two Jerichos. There was the old city and there was the new city, and they were both pretty much side by side. So one could be referring to one city, one could be referring to, the new city or the old city, or one could actually refer to both of them as being all of Jericho. So again, there's no contradiction, and you shouldn't think that there's a contradiction because it's very simple. Uh, unless, of course, you're out to destroy Christianity, in which that's just doing a very uh, pitiful job at that, because that you're totally taking the context out, cherry picking verses, and if you notice again, they only give the first part, they don't actually give any true context, nor do they want to give any context. So, besides having the entire uh, image wrong due to saying Jerusalem, it's actually Jericho, uh, their entire thinking is flawed. They're looking for contradictions when there are no contradictions there.